Pour notre prochain conférencier, donc entrepreneur, vétéran de l'industrie des médias numériques, donc bientôt investisseur, je ne sais pas si je devrais dire ça pour pas que le monde aille le harceler pour avoir de l'argent tout de suite. Donc, Sabaa Quao a dirigé et collaboré avec des équipes de marketing et technologie dans plus de 12 pays. Donc, on parle beaucoup, encore une fois, futur, se réinventer, mais ici, ça va être vraiment plus comme la persévérance, comme comment persister finalement et survivre pour durer 25, voire même 50 ans dans l'industrie. Donc, je vous invite à accueillir Sabaa Quao. Je vais juste t'attendre. Je vais
Thank you. I was looking forward to today. I was here yesterday, and I did hear a lot of presentations that weave in and out of some of what I'm going to talk about today, and a lot of it is about context as creative people and the span of time that passes and all the chaos that happens in front of us that is making people justifiably nervous, but I will probably leave you with a note of optimism. So, some background, I'm a career entrepreneur. I've worked for myself 90% of my career, but every now and then I go and work for a company and I get to learn some new things. And I've been trained in design, I've studied business, I have been a VP strategy, I've been a chief creative and chief innovation officer, and I've also worked in short film. I started a short film festival in London and Bucharest that's been running for 17 years, so I understand some parts of the industry in a different way. And when I joined Cassette, I'd been building a fintech. I'm a fintech entrepreneur, and so we kind of did this deal to collaborate together while I came on board as Chief Creative and Innovation Officer. And I've spent a lot of time with startups, because startups give me a lot of energy, it's a fast place to learn, and I like the pace at which they move. So now, I'm building Plusco Venture Studio, which is an offshoot from Cassette and Plus Company, our holding company. And it's really made me pause and think about the context of a creative career and where and how you sustain it regardless of the amount of change going on in front of you all the time. Cassette is over 50 years old. So born in 1972, and it's a remarkable thing for a creative company to last for 50 years. And in fact, it's a remarkable thing for any company to last for 50 years. And McKinsey had done a study, and right now, the average lifespan of a company is 18 years. In 1960, it was 61 years. So you see this shrinking of the company. So unlike our parents or our grandparents who may have worked in one company for the entire course of their careers, it's not likely going to happen. So there's a disruption in terms of the structure around you. And at the same time, all that disruption that we've been talking about over the last day and a half is counterbalanced against innovation. So there's some sense of things dropping through the floor, and at the same time, there's a wide open discussion around innovation in terms of where and how things will move forward. So I'm going to break out this discussion and ask you to reframe your thinking. And I'm going to ask you to think in the context of 25 years, as a counter to all the distraction of social media and short-term and reaction things and outrage and all this change that's happening in front of you, and I want you to pull back and think about a 25-year timeline. 25 years is interesting because it represents usually a generation. And if we think of where we are at this 2025 mark, late 90s was the beginning of the digital era, and a whole bunch of things happened, and then there was a huge meltdown. And here we are, literally 25 years later, at the start of something quite provocative and interesting. And yes, anxiety-inducing, but it's one generation, and I want you to think about that. And some of the things I'll talk about, I've had a career that, if you're under 45, there's some references here that maybe won't make sense because you weren't in the digital era at the beginning, but you will understand the relevance when I pair it with things that we're seeing today. So think of 2000, big meltdown, and a whole bunch of companies disappear. Webvan, Boo.com, Napster, there was a browser war between, or search engine wars between Alta Vista and Lycos, and Pets.com and MySpace wiped out. My career had been going along quite nicely with a lot of technology and digital stuff, and at one point, we had lost so much money from the wipeout that I was paying payroll out of my pocket. So I understand what it is for the bottom to fall out from underneath you, but then we look at the survivors. And Yahoo, Amazon, both born in 1994, eBay 1995, Netflix 1997, and Google. And there's something interesting about that. They started off during that chaotic period, but they survived. And when I look at the dates from 2000 forward, you get a list of companies and brands that we all recognize, and as people who work in the creative industry, these became the platforms and the spaces that we work on. Google AdWords changed the business model around marketing and advertising and created a different kind of economic and pricing model. The iPad and everything that's come after that, in terms of our assumptions about surfaces, about music, about streaming. So there are all these ecosystems that evolved from those companies that came right after the collapse. And then we look at the stock market today and they say, what are the companies that are driving the economy? It's these platforms or derivatives of these platforms that are actually driving growth. So one thing to think about is, when I referenced those companies that did disappear, there are a whole bunch of companies that you're looking at now in the news, and at least 50% of them are not going to make it. Just because OpenAI came out of the gates, and we all know what ChatGPT is, well, Netscape at one point was the #1 browser. So there's no guarantee of anything, and at the same time, these platforms are big enough and pervasive enough that you have to commit. You have to spend time engaging with these platforms, knowing that some of them are going to disappear, but I'm saying that doesn't matter. Because what happened was, all those platforms created a giant expansion of our creative space. These became the platforms upon which we build our technology, where we express ideas, how we make our ads, how we develop pretty much everything that we do. So the creative space actually got bigger. And the kinds of people in these industries are the people who dove into those platforms and those creative spaces, because none of us had to accept those spaces passively. So if you were a non-creative person and those digital spaces started, you were sort of going to accept what was given to you. But we dove in, and we built things on top of those platforms, and we're going to do the same thing right now. So what happens is we end up with a surge of creativity. It happens to be mediated by technology, but it's still an overall expansion. And it doesn't mean that everything is going to be technology mediated, and there are going to be a whole bunch of side issues that have to be contended with. But that expansion mediated by technology is, again, what we're in the middle of right now. I'm going to ask you to think about creativity with a capital C, not just film, art, and design, but it's all the other places that creativity is applied that add to this overall expansion of space. Technology, science, business models. We've seen a couple of presentations already that talked about the change in economics. And to deal with those new economic and creative outputs, those are also creative applications. So some of what creative people are going to need to do is show up in different places to solve different kinds of problems. It's not going to be just about the assets that we create. It's sometimes going to be about platforms and processes as well. So let's start at 2025, and let's contend with this creative disruption, and let's compare it to this. We have this benefit of hindsight, and suddenly, you know what? Some crazy things will happen, but maybe it's not so bad, and we have to start to iterate and think how we're going to move forward from there. So now is the time that we have to nurture what I call unique combinations. It's going to be about different kinds of collaborations, and some of this period of time where your creative value actually goes up, not down. The economic numbers will shift and adjust, but your creative value is actually going to increase. And you have to start to open up your mind and think about, maybe this is a world-building period. And I like to use that word because those of you who've worked in games and comics and animations, you understand world building because you get to play God and you get to build things from scratch. And you get to build a creative universe of something new. About 10 years ago, I was asked to teach a screenwriting course. And one of the course materials I used was an article from Wired magazine that said, "You won't live to see the final Star Wars movie." So think of George Lucas presenting for the first time. He had little puppets and little maquettes, and he was explaining this story of a space opera. Sounded a little crazy. But here we are, decades later, and that world that he built and the platform that he built is so big and so cohesive and so coherent. It's got different writers, different starting points. My mom would understand what Darth Vader is no differently than my kids. And that is an interesting expansion of an idea that is worth literally tens of billions of dollars. Now, not everyone's going to go out and say, well, I'm going to go out and create a Star Wars movie, but he didn't start off thinking that big either. He started off trying to accomplish this one thing in front of him first, but it got me thinking about what we do as creative people, and we always obsess on this vertical around the uniqueness of what we're doing. That's what we do day in, day out. We're always trying to come up with something new. But if we contemplate this idea around expansiveness and longevity, we actually have the potential to build something bigger than just dealing with something small. So when we get a brief, and I'm sitting down with creative teams, and I say, you know, the brief has defined us on a piece of paper a certain way, but at the very start of the process, where we have no interference from client, you get left alone for a little bit of time, I encourage them to break the brief by saying, tell me about how expansive or how long you can go on an idea. So I can talk that way with creative people, and then when I talk to business people, I use actually a bit of the same discussion, and I put it, let's say, on a 2x2 matrix, which is a standard business school decision-making matrix, and I say, let's just have this axis on uniqueness, but this long, expansive arc is no different from how we break down strategy. Is it long-term? Is it defensible? Can we build some kind of sustainable competitive advantage? I might not use the same words talking to a creative audience, but in a business audience, I'm saying we're still trying to accomplish the same thing, because if you only attend with all these short, little fragmented things, it's very hard to create value. So that creation of value is really about saying, let's continue to push creatively on that vertical axis, but let's challenge ourselves to say, don't get distracted by some of the short-term things going on, and start to think about this notion of what is expansive and where can you build this longevity into an idea. And that gets you into this magic quadrant of actual creation of value. I'm going to use those economic terms, not, it sometimes comes across a little bit abrasive, but creative people do intuitively understand how we create value and what we put out into the world. And we have to, at some point, deal with the business value, because this notion of compensation has started to come up in several of the discussions over the last couple of days. So right now, I'd spent 2.5 years as Chief Creative and Chief Creative and Innovation Officer, and I had a discussion with the CFO and the CEO, and I said, I'm starting to feel this existential worry about how fast we're going, because we build things that have done wonders in a very traditional way. Cassette's work reaches 95% of the Canadian population every week. We have that many clients, that many projects. And I was still nervous because I said, if I wander through my discussion with my startup community, they are moving way faster than anything that we're doing. So I pitched them back and I said, why don't I build a venture studio? Why don't I start to work with personalization, synthetic data, some of the explorations around e-commerce? I'll point out e-commerce. We've all bought our airline tickets and hotels online, probably now for 20, 25 years. But if I said to you that e-commerce is still nascent, Shopify just released their results about a month ago, and one of the notes in there said only 1 out of every 5 retail dollars is driven by e-commerce, and I was shocked. I was also excited because I said, oh, e-commerce can actually double. I'm often not too interested in things that are incremental. How do you grow 1%, 2% market share? Entrepreneurs are always about, how do we get 80% of a market? You think big. So when I thought about how many things are you working on that could actually double, e-commerce is one of them. So a lot of this is about playing with different platforms, different starting points, and rethinking business models that are going to affect our business, but are also the kinds of questions that are being asked differently of us from our clients. Sometimes they're not so concerned with the commercial or the asset creation. They want us to solve a problem further up the food chain. And again, we need more creative people in there because it's not going to work in a very rigid or predictable way. So that business model innovation is going to call for what I call unlikely people, sometimes working in unlikely or coming from unlikely places. The presentation before talked about a pod or a team in Senegal. There's a lot going on in small ecosystems. I've been in Edmonton and Calgary over the last month. I was in Trinidad last summer and realized that all these small countries, some of them are investing large in cybersecurity, training their workforces. And so this notion of unlikely people coming from unlikely places, I'm obsessed with small ecosystems. Quebec is a small ecosystem, and it's incredible the impact that Quebec has had creatively on the world. Canada's a small country. We rank number 4 at Cannes on the Festival of Creativity. And what's interesting is we have a tiny population because above and below us are Brazil, USA, England, Spain, France. We're tiny, and we rank number 4. So you start to see the potential of what can come out of a small ecosystem, and when you get these leveling of the playing fields like the digital era, like the AI era, small ecosystems actually might sometimes have a bigger advantage than a large ecosystem where if you try and change something in the United States or if you try and change something in Brazil, it's just hard. So work with that advantage. And that means creative people, outlier thinking, odd intelligence, nonlinear but also professional skill. And I always encourage creativity to be chaos at the top, but we're professional creative people, so we know how to land the plane. It's this professional skill that allows us to package something with consistency, but without the creativity, there is no value creation. And again, I love speaking at business schools and reminding all the finance and investment banker wannabes that they will have nothing to invest in unless we come up with stuff that's worth building or that audiences actually want. Along the way, when we think about this career timeline, you're not going to stay static. It's going to be about building an evolving mix of personas, an evolving mix of ideas. You're going to try new things. Some of them are going to be provocative. Some of them are going to be controversial. But without a doubt, we're not going to be doing things that are boring. So we're luckier than most to work in an industry where we're going to be building and reframing and rethinking and pulling new things out of ourselves to get there. And I've had a creative career long enough and varied enough to say, I say to my own kids, you might not end up doing just one thing, but if you can pay attention to the through line, you'll actually constantly be able to build and move forward and build something much larger than what you would have expected. It doesn't mean that I'm ignoring the elephant in the room. AI comes with some issues. Ethical issues, economic issues, ownership issues. But here we have a room full of people who aren't being passive. Again, we're playing with the tools. We're bending them, we're breaking them, we're uniquely combining. I had 2 friends meet for the first time, and they started talking about an overlap in an industry that they both are aware of. And these unique combinations are going to be mediated by AI, but we're not going to be passive about it. We're going to build new things. And in a way, the only lesson I have to leave you with is let's continue to do what we do best, and that is to create. Thank you.